Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar on censorship and criminalization of political academic speech. My name is Andrew Ross. I'm a professor of social and cultural analysis at NYU. I'm the secretary of the NYU chapter of the American Association of University Professors, and I'm also a member of the organizing committee of USACBI, which is the American branch of the BDS movement. I want to first acknowledge that this webinar is being hosted here on the occupied homelands of the Lenape peoples. And it's especially relevant since our topic for today is in part driven by the violent dispossession and displacement of the Palestinian people from their own homelands, thousands of miles away. This webinar is one of a series of campus events taking place across the US, Canada, and the UK, exactly 1 month after the corporate tech giants, Zoom, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, all shut down a San Francisco State University open classroom conversation with Leila Khaled, who is a Palestinian resistance icon. The censorship of this event by all of these platforms was unprecedented as far as we can gather. And it raises some very serious questions about how and why these platforms, and Zoom especially, since it enjoys lucrative contracts with universities during this pandemic phase, why are they in a position to shut down academic events in complete violation of the principles of academic freedom? So USACBI put out a call for the Day of Action, and it has been co-sponsored by dozens of national organizations. The AUP chapter at NYU decided to respond by hosting this event. Why? Because the AUP is a national steward of academic freedom and academic rights, and also has long supported the endangered expression of Palestinian speech on the NYU campus. Yesterday, a second campaign by organized Zionist groups succeeded in pressuring Zoom to shut down one of today's events at the University of Hawaii for entirely spurious reasons. The Hawaii administration did nothing really to stop Zoom, a corporate third-party vendor, from censoring this academic event. And this is a predicament or a show of cowardice, depending on how you look at it, that should concern everyone in higher education right now. Earlier today, Zoom also shut down this NYU event on its platform. The NYU administration has told us they knew nothing about it, which actually makes the censorship even worse. The shutdown of any campus event is a clear violation of the principle of academic freedom that universities are obliged to observe. And allowing a private vendor, an outside private vendor, to override this bedrock principle is a very serious error for any university administration to make. And so we are urging the NYU administration to take action. If Zoom will not withdraw its decision, then college presidents should really break their contracts with this company. There's another reason, however, why we're holding this webinar. The evidence shows that Palestinian speech, or speech about Palestinian rights, is always the first to be attacked and shut down. Indeed, it's fair to say that one thing that all university presidents in the US agree on is the need to crack down on Palestinian expression, or at least to show that they are holding their nose while defending it. And those of us who speak up in this issue are well aware of the vilification that will follow, as sure as night follows day. And in this regard, I just want to cite the words of Susan Abul Hawa, the great Palestinian writer, and incidentally, the co-president of the upcoming festival called Palestine Rights. That's WRITES, and that will take place in early December. I urge everyone to attend the festival. This is what Abul Hawa once wrote. She said, "No matter who you are, no matter what greatness you've achieved in your life, or what gifts you've given to the rest of humanity, if you criticize Israel, you must expect to become persona non grata. You should expect an utter onslaught of attacks." It's time to end what Abu Hawa and others are referring to, the so-called Palestinian exception when it comes to speech protection. Or, perhaps it's more accurate to also call it the Israeli exception, since the core issue here is the prohibition on any criticism of Israeli policies since 1948, and the conflation of that criticism with the charge of anti-Semitism. It's time to put an end to this speech exceptionalism on college campuses and in public life generally. So let's get to the program and the speakers. Katherine Franke, who was scheduled to appear at this webinar, couldn't join us because of a last-minute conflict. Leila Khaled is undergoing medical treatment right now and was unable to record a message, so the organizers put together a brief compilation to ensure that her voice and image is present here. So just by way of introducing this clip, I'll say that Khaled is one of the most revered figures in the historical resistance to the colonization of Palestinian land and life. Her family were forcibly evicted from Haifa during the Nakba of 1948. And while in exile as a refugee, she became politicized through the Arab nationalist movement. After 1967, she joined a resistance unit of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which the US regards as a terrorist organization. And she played a legendary role in 2 airplane hijackings in the late 1960s, both of them conceived as a spectacular way to draw international attention to the injustices suffered by the Palestinian people. Since then, she's continued to speak publicly about Palestinian liberation and the fundamental right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homelands. She's revered in the Arab world and elsewhere for the role model that she established as a female freedom fighter. So I'm going to show you this clip, if I can find it.
We are not afraid of struggle. We are afraid of giving up. Our people never gave up in the past, and not now, and not in the future. It's because we have supporters all over the world.
I think a freedom fighter is a part of a people who are struggling for their freedom. Many resistance movements in the world, including South African resistance, was described by the West that this is terrorist acts. The most dangerous thing is when it is a state terrorism against the people. What can we speak about occupying Palestine by the Israelis and not abiding by international law to withdraw, and yet Israel is going on with its occupation. This is a state terrorism against the people. So when we speak about terrorism, we speak it in terms of occupation, apartheid. And in Palestine, there is occupation and apartheid system in Israel. This is terrorism, while resistance is illegal and recognized and experienced means for a people to get their freedom.
They tell us, you are, the Palestinians are terrorists. Imagine that the colonialists call the Palestinians who were driven out from their homeland and that they are the terrorists, while occupation, they don't mean it, or they don't say that occupation is the peak of terrorism. The whole world suffered from colonialism, but it ended in many countries. We remember Vietnam, we remember Algiers, we remember South Africa, we remember Cuba, we remember all the struggles of peoples for liberation and for freedom. We have used all means of struggle. And we are still determined to continue using all means of struggle, including armed struggle. Whoever would tell us that this is not your right, I will tell them, go back to history. Go back to history and go back to the United Nations Charter. The international community recognized that people under oppression have the right to resist. I'm optimistic about the historical victory that we will achieve with you, with your support, with this solidarity, with going to BDS, boycott, divest, and sanctions against Israel to isolate this apartheid state. When it's isolated, it is the first step towards victory.
Up till now, our country is still occupied by the Zionists. And there are 7 million Palestinian refugees who are not allowed to go back to their homeland because of this occupation. But one day, we will be all together, returning back to Palestine to celebrate the victory of all the peoples of the world, because Palestine is a just cause and is a human cause.
The key for ending this conflict, the return of the refugees, to go back to their homelands and properties. There, we can together, whoever accepts this solution, together to establish a democratic state in Palestine. For all of us, everyone is equal in rights and duties.
Okay, very strong words from Leila Khaled. Our first speaker in the webinar is Nerdeen Kiswani, another female freedom fighter and New York City organizer, and someone who has suffered a torrent of racial harassment for her views. She's a founder and chair of Within Our Lifetime, United for Palestine, Palestinian-led community organization building the movement for liberation. Its goal is to revitalize the revolutionary spirit of Palestinians abroad to align with oppressed nationality struggles around the world and complement the resistance in Palestine. She's also a second-year law student at CUNY School of Law, where she organizes with Students for Justice in Palestine. And I should add, the CUNY Law School's administration has not done a very good job of protecting her rights and her well-being. Welcome, Nerdeen.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's really upsetting that we have to start off on this note, having to do the webinar like this because Zoom shut us down and censored us on a webinar about censorship. I was asked today to speak, about the attacks that I've been facing at CUNY recently, as well as what Leila Khaled means to me, Palestinians, Palestinian women overall. And I just wanted to start with that. As you've seen in the clip, as you heard from Andrew, Leila Khaled is a Palestinian freedom fighter who is highly respected and cherished in our liberation struggle. She fearlessly hijacked planes multiple times while making sure not to hurt anybody. Many of the people who were on the planes that day were interviewed later on, and they said that they didn't feel fear. I even watched an interview of a little boy where he said he was having, it was cool and he had fun. So Leila Khaled and those with her had strict instructions not to harm anyone and only defend themselves. And she explains the reasoning behind the hijacking perfectly in one quote. When we hijacked the planes, the whole world wondered who we were. Regardless of what they thought about it, they wondered. But when we were tortured in Israeli prisons, who heard our screams? We had to do what we did in order to get your attention. During the 1969 hijacking of the TWA flight, She forced a pilot to fly over Haifa so that she could look at the hometown that she was not even permitted to visit, such as most Palestinians are denied the right to return or even visit their homeland. She was born in Haifa and became a refugee with her family at a camp in Lebanon, the fate of so many Palestinians. She can't remember a time when she wasn't politicized and committed herself full-time to armed struggle at the age of 15. The terrorist narrative, as old and tired as it is being used by Zionists and their ilk and legitimized by services like Zoom, who think they can say who is and isn't a terrorist. And I think Layla Khaled says it best in her own words, which is why I wish Zoom would let her speak. But they're not even allowing that. She said, "Who planted terrorism in our area? Some came and took our land, forced us to leave, forced us to live in camps. I think this is terrorism. Using means to resist this terrorism and stop its effects, this is called struggle." So Layla Khaled, as you can see, she means so much to women. She means so much to Palestinians. She's an icon in the Palestinian liberation struggle. And she justifies, I think, everything that she said, her actions, what happened was necessitated, before she hijacked any planes, before Hamas existed. In 1948, there was the Nakba that dispossessed 750,000 Palestinians, upwards of that, forced them to exile from their own homeland, and destroyed over 531 Palestinian villages. This is a fate that so many Palestinians are still experiencing, every single Palestinian is experiencing to this day. And this is why Layla Khaled means so much to me, particularly as a woman. She also said that a woman can be a fighter, a freedom fighter, a political activist. She can fall in love, be married, have children, and be a mother. Because liberation and because struggling for liberation and struggling for revolution is part of being a Palestinian. It's not a separate identity, it's who we are. And that's why I've always looked up to her since I was a little girl, because I also don't remember a time when I wasn't politicized. Watching Muhammad al-Durra get shot on TV by IDF soldiers during the Second Intifada when I was probably under the age of 5 was a pivotal moment. I knew that I had to spend my life struggling against Zionism and this ideology that slaughters my people. This is what led me to community organizing and even organizing an SJP in college. And by the time I was 21 years old, despite being an American citizen, Israel denied me the right to visit my own homeland. But this only further politicized me, as one of my biggest fears was actualized, denied entry. But that only put me on par with the Palestinians living in refugee camps all over the Arab world who can never even dream of visiting. The Palestinians in Gaza who can't ever see Al-Aqsa Mosque, or the ones in the West Bank who have never been to a beach. Eventually, I co-founded Within Our Lifetime, and one of our very first statements as an organization quotes Layla Khaled. To this day, we are inspired by her ongoing revolutionary spirit and commitment to the struggle. And the support of people like Layla Khaled has always been met with anger and accusation from Zionists. Just fighting for the liberation of Palestine alone is enough to warrant accusations of supporting terrorism from these well-funded Zionist campaigns that are meant to target activists in order to silence us, very much like how they're trying to silence us today. And ever since being outspoken about my organizing for Palestine, I've received numerous death threats, rape threats, Islamophobic and racist slurs hurled at me, and of course, accusations of supporting terrorism and anti-Semitism. Most recently, this culminated into a well-funded campaign from an app with deep ties to the Israeli government and army, putting out a call to action to get people to email my law school, asking them to expel me because I supposedly set a fellow student on fire. It's an accusation so ridiculous, it's honestly laughable. Like, it just feels weird saying it out loud. The protest performance in which I joked around with a friend about burning an IDF hoodie, which was all staged, it featured the specific logo of the Israeli military, the same force that murders, executes, sieges, ethnically cleanses, and genocides the Palestinian people on a daily basis. This army and its symbols symbolizes the army that I saw shoot Muhammad al-Durra when I was a child. It symbolizes the army that razed Gaza to the ground multiple times and has committed some of the world's most atrocious and well-documented human rights abuses. And this false campaign was weaponized against me to spread a narrative that I was anti-Semitic and that I supported terrorism, or that, some even said that I was a terrorist, trying to discredit me as a student, activist, and a future lawyer. And in response to this racist campaign, rather than protect me, the CUNY Law Administration chose to make 3 public posts on social media. First, declaring that CUNY Law stands against hate and anti-Semitism, replacing that with CUNY Law stands against hate and harassment, and then with CUNY Law stands against hate, in which they ended up deleting all 3 statements eventually. Initially expressing concern for the pain caused by a social media video, rather than showing concern, about me, their Palestinian student who was receiving thousands of threats, so many DMs on all these social media platforms, people telling me they knew where I live, people telling me that they were going to have people come after me, that they were going to shoot me. And while I'm still in talks with the administration, and there was a private apology, there hasn't really been anything made public after that. The last thing that they said publicly is, showing concern about the feelings of people who are allegedly hurt by a protest performance, which implies that, burning IDF sweatshirts and merchandise is something that can, be understood as like anti-Semitic or causing hurt against people, rather than seeing the symbol for what it is, as an occupying, invading military force. While they did apologize privately and took the post down, it's worth noting that it took a mere couple of hours to get the law school to issue a statement 3 times in one day. And I'm still waiting on a public apology many, many days later. Of course, the comparison to anti-Semitism in this case is so absurd. It's actually offensive. And one of the first organizations that released a statement at CUNY Law in support of me, the Jewish Law Students Association, put it best when they said, conflating symbols of Israel, a settler colonial nation state with one of the most powerful militaries in the world and a record of well-documented human rights abuses, with symbols of Jewish people, silences the free speech that CUNY Law purports to hold so dear. We know, and that's the end of that quote, but we know that Zionism is a racist ideology built on the dispossession of Palestinian land and the destruction of Palestinian lives. And we know that it's anti-racist to oppose Zionism, and it's essential to fighting racism, especially when the occupation of Palestine is central to the US imperialist project globally. Commitment to Palestinian liberation necessitates resistance to war criminals, colonizers, and occupiers. And the logo and symbols of the Israeli occupation forces should be viewed as a hate symbol. When I see that symbol, that's a hate symbol. This is something that administrations like CUNY, people all over the world need to understand. And to condemn those who stand against a racist occupation army is to stand on the side of racism, injustice, and oppression. But our oppression as Palestinians is not recognized. It's not seen as legitimate a lot of times by these administrations, which is why they're so quick to dismiss us standing against a symbol of an army like that. And instead of working to have CUNY boycott Israel's institutions, which is what I want to do, while I'm a student here, I'm put on the defense of such a baseless accusation. However, there's been so much support from the CUNY student body, from professors, faculty, and even individuals on the administration ever since this happened, from the We Stand with Nerdeen campaign that was come up with by students, to statements released by CUNY NLG, the Jewish Law Students Association, Latin American Law Students Association, formerly incarcerated Law Students Association, and even outside organizations like Samadoun, the Red Nation, the International League of People's Struggle, and Bayan in the Philippines, and even organizations in France. As a Palestinian, I know that our expressive and artistic resistance is repeatedly subject to criminalization, harassment, and suppression, from the imprisonment of Palestinian poets like Nerdeen to the Mossad assassination of Palestinian writers like Ghassan Kanafani. All over the world, we are silenced simply for speaking, simply for expressing ourselves, whether we're speaking on Zoom, whether we're making protest performances on TikTok, whether we're writing poetry or writing for people like Ghassan Kanafani. It takes place in many different ways. CUNY is not, not to compare myself to Ghassan Kanafani or anything like that, because he was assassinated, but at the end of the day, this is all a form to silence us. And it's unfortunate that they're doing this once again here on this call, on this webinar, with Zoom trying to silence us for talking about Layla Khaled, for the very simple fact that she was going to send a message to us today. But I'll end there. Hopefully that'll bring a lot more context to what I've experienced at CUNY, and I'm really excited to hear from everybody else. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Nerdeen, for these very powerful words. Our next speaker is my fabulous colleague, Fred Moten, who teaches in the Department of Performance Studies in the Tisch School of the Arts here at NYU. He also serves on the executive committee of our AAUP chapter. He's the author of many widely acclaimed books, and the most recent book is co-written with Stefano Harney, is called All Incomplete, and is published by Autonomous Media and Minor Compositions this year. So, Fred.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and it's an honor to be here with you guys today. Obviously, I can't speak with the intensity and the eloquence that Nerdeen spoke with. I'm not going to try, and I'm not going to go on for a long, long time in a way that would siphon off the force of what she said. But I do just want to read a little paragraph that that really, I hope, just asks some questions that maybe we can talk about amongst ourselves, but that other folks can begin to talk about too. So I'll just do that now. Why is it that Palestinian expression must be shut down in an enactment of the very exceptionalism that defenders of Israel's state policy claim as their special burden, or that they claim as the special burden that Israel is forced to bear? Why must defense of this settler colonial state be accompanied by the muffling of those who are its victims and its challengers? Perhaps it's because it is the defense of the idea and ideality of the settler colonial state, and therefore of the state itself, which is at stake. That defense demands exclusion that is modeled on the structures of exclusion which the state itself enacts, even and especially when such enactment requires the state to violate its most revered principles and to suppress the institutions that are designed to protect and foster those principles. Part of what we in the American university have to consider now is what it is for us to have been made custodians of those principles, even as we are made to watch when they are dissolved in an infernal public-private partnership for which the university has long been a research and public relations arm. It's not that the interdictions of our speech within an institution that has long been disciplined and contained, that has long disciplined and contained speech while preaching the free speech gospel aren't vicious and repressive. It's that this ought not drive us to defend an abstract principle of free speech, which is only ever concretized and is usually at the same moment dishonestly and disgustingly sacralized in exclusion. Instead, and in refusal of that, let's claim and eruptively assert our fugitive speech, which is fueled by the realization of the conditions we live in. Those conditions are characterized most generally as contradiction. The contradiction of those of us who enjoy the luxury of a so-called freedom to speak under conditions of a war of conquest that is also a war on subsistence, and which is visited in differentiated and unequal ways on and through the experience of luxury and impoverishment. Under those conditions, we in the US university are free only to constrain and regulate our speech, lest the scale of the war on subsistence is tipped against rather than for us. Meanwhile, those who have been so much more brutally muzzled, even unto the routinization of their maiming and their death, speak anyway in conditions of open repression. They speak without asking to speak, and they speak a demand so fundamental that apology is beside the point. Layla Khalid not only refuses to be silenced, she refuses to speak the language and the false pieties of those who prosecute the war in which we live, and which we are all apt to deny which we are all too apt to deny when we appeal to a freedom we don't have and which Palestinians can't have. Poetry is not a luxury, as Audre Lorde famously said, but it's not free either. Its fugitive force costs something, and we have to see how we might agree to pay and share that cost. Why, given the contradictions of free speech, would we try to exercise it? Instead, let's exorcise this liberal illusion along with the more immediately deadly materialities of military corporate liberalism, which are given in conquest and deprivation, which we now have to speak and act against, both openly and surreptitiously.
You're done, Fred?
I'm done.
Thank you so much for that insightful analysis, diagnosing our predicament here in the belly of the beast. Our last speaker, Radhika Sainath, is a senior staff attorney at Palestine Legal, where she oversees the organization's work defending the constitutional rights of activists to advocate for Palestinian freedom. In 2019, together with the Center for Constitutional Rights, she won a landmark lawsuit compelling Fordham University to recognize Students for Justice in Palestine as a student club. She's advised hundreds of students and professors around the country who've been targeted for principled speech supporting Palestinian rights. Radhika.
Thanks for having me. For those of you who don't know about Palestine Legal, we provide free legal support for students, professors, and grassroots activists in the United States who are censored or punished for standing up for Palestinian freedom. Here to talk to you today about censorship of voices, Palestinian voices speaking up for Palestinian rights on US college campuses. I talk a lot about this topic, but it's very rare that my own events get censored. So it is really unfortunate that that happened today, but this is why we're here. And while we're talking on the subject, I just want to say that it can feel a little bit demoralizing at times to see how people who bravely speak out for Palestinian freedom, like Nerdeen, are targeted with these censorship attempts, with these false accusations. They're harassed. But there is a reason why this is happening. And the reason is because there is this growing movement for Palestinian rights in the United States. And it's growing exponentially, and it's incredible to see what's happening on college campuses here in this country. You have over 200 Students for Justice in Palestine groups now. We also have, Jewish Voice for Peace chapters, other student groups supporting Palestinian rights with different names. Divestment resolutions have been passed at over 50 campuses, most recently at Columbia University. So the support for Palestinian rights is incredible. And the reason why we're seeing speech targeted at college campuses is because I think Israel and its staunchest defenders realize that that is where change is happening. And that's why we're seeing it, and we really do see it at Palestine Legal. And that's why, we're here today, because after the event last month at San Francisco State University was pulled by Zoom. We're here talking about this issue at so many other campuses, which in turn Zoom has also pulled. And I just want to say that what happened at SFSU last month was incredible in that, I'll just say I'm from California, and Zoom threatened to pull Zoom from the entire Cal State University system if SFSU didn't censor the talk. That's incredible. That's 480,000 students. I believe it was 23 campuses. And, basically Zoom was making itself the arbiter of what gets said on college campuses, what debates are had, what teachers get to teach, what students get to hear. And the reason that they pulled that talk was because anti-Palestinian groups complained, and they falsely threatened. They said that Zoom would be subjected to a federal investigation for "quote unquote" material support for terrorism. Again, for allowing a conversation to take place with Layla Khalid and other revolutionaries who were really active in the 60s and 70s. So this is incredible, and but I just want to say it's not unique. And what we're seeing is that a lot of money thrown into stopping advocacy for Palestinian rights in the United States. Israel itself has thrown, I believe, over $800,000 into just developing a legal network to stop boycott efforts on college campuses. Even Israel's spy agency, the Mossad, is being used to stop boycott efforts as well. So that's pretty incredible. And at Palestine Legal, we document incidents of suppression. Since 2014, we've responded to over 1,500 incidents. And there's different tactics that are being used. Nerdeen talked about a few that she herself has experienced. But one tactic that I just want to quickly talk about today, because this isn't a New York University talk, is the tactic of deploying, of filing false claims saying that schools violate Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 if they allow criticism of Israel to take place on college campuses. Now, Title VI is a good thing, right? It says that universities could lose federal funding if they allow a hostile environment to take place against their students who are under certain protected characteristics. But Zionist groups, including Kenneth Marcus's Brandeis Center, have developed a strategy to misuse these laws to file these complaints. And they filed numerous such complaints during the Obama years. None of them were successful. And they targeted speech on college campuses like teach-ins on Palestine, discussions on Gaza, movie screenings, street theater actions illustrating how Palestinians are stopped at Israeli army checkpoints, divestment debates, normal things that students talk about on campuses and should be able to talk about. None of these complaints were successful, but Kenneth Marcus in an op-ed quite clearly said that they achieved the goal, which was to chill speech supporting Palestinian rights. And that's really the goal of these tactics. And what we saw when Trump got elected is that he very quickly nominated Kenneth Marcus to head the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, which oversees these complaints. So it was a fox guarding a hen house type of situation. And a lot of people on college campuses who wanted to hold events and teach and do regular types of things were quite rightly scared. What was going to happen now? Would they be able to hold events talking about how Israel stops Palestinians at checkpoints or kills Palestinian civilians in Gaza? And what we saw quite quickly was that a number of groups started filing, again, these types of complaints. And one complaint was filed against NYU. That complaint claimed that NYU was violating Title VI of the Civil Rights Act because of incidents such as SJP being awarded a President's Award for its great work, for a department at NYU saying that it would boycott NYU's Tel Aviv satellite campus because of discriminatory treatment towards Arabs and Muslims and Palestinians. And a graduation speaker congratulating his colleagues and for standing up for BDS. Things like that were in the complaint. And interestingly, earlier this month, the lawyers who brought the complaint announced a settlement and cheered it as his big victory. But if you look at the settlement, It's interesting in that it doesn't say that NYU did anything wrong for allowing criticism of Israel on campus. It didn't say that SJP did anything wrong, or JVP did anything wrong, or any supporter of Palestinian rights, or any professor who had spoken out for Palestinian freedom had done anything wrong. So this was incredible because the Zionists basically had everything going for them to the very, very top, right? And the best that they got was this agreement that where NYU agreed to use the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's definition of anti-Semitism. Now that definition includes some illustrative examples of anti-Semitism, which are quite problematic because they define anti-Semitism to include using quote unquote a double standard for Israel and saying things like Israel is a racist state. So basically defining anti-Semitism to not just include hatred of Jews as a people, which obviously should be stopped and not tolerated anywhere, including on college campuses, but to also go farther and define it to include criticizing Israel, which is very problematic. But the settlement says nothing about using those examples. It says nothing about defining anti-Semitism as criticizing Israel. And in fact, in an interview with the Inside Higher Ed, NYU spokesperson was very clear in saying, we support academic freedom and free speech, and we're not using those examples. So where does that leave people at NYU, students and professors who want to organize for Palestinian freedom, who want to talk about boycott, divestment, sanctions campaigns, who want to support that? Well, we say to you, go forth with your organizing. Keep on talking about how Zionism is racism. Keep on, advocating for boycotts for Palestinian rights. Wear your keffiyehs. Feel free to talk about how Israel is an apartheid state. You are allowed to do that. There is nothing in that you can't. And should NYU try to censor you or punish you, they would be violating your free speech rights. And should the Department of Education or any US body or government body try to punish NYU for allowing criticism of Israel or support for Palestinian rights, their First Amendment rights would be violated. So that's where I'll leave it. And if anyone is watching this and they have a question about their legal rights or are censored or punished, please feel free to contact Palestine Legal. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Radhika, and in particular for drawing attention to the settlement here at NYU, which, and thank you for the encouragement for students and faculty who speak up for these rights. The fact that the administration here at NYU hasn't come up with its own version and publicized it is a cause of concern for some of us, because it leaves things, the speech situation, in a bit of a limbo. But hopefully that will be clarified soon. And indeed, the Zoom shutdown of this webinar today may help to precipitate something more productive in that regard. I just want to invite all three of you, if you want to comment on anything anyone else has said or that's come up. There's a couple of questions that were sent beforehand by executive members of the AUP chapter. I'll pose these afterwards, but if you want to take up any of the issues that one of the three of you raised, this would be a good time.
I'll just quickly say that I really wanted to uplift what Radhika said about, not letting these things demoralize us, and these attacks, show that, that we're always going to be attacked and that there's no recourse. Because at the end of the day, I detailed all the attacks that I've been facing at CUNY, but the support that I felt has been much more overwhelming in a good way. I was able, to see so many students vocalize their support, not only for me, but for Palestinian liberation in a way that, it may not have happened, had we not faced these attacks. So it's always important to, be optimistic and see this as part of the, ongoing trend in trying to silence us, simply because we are growing and simply because we're winning. And while they have, millions of dollars to fund their apps, and we're doing this work for free, we're still beating them. And that's an amazing success story. So I really just want to uplift that because we want to continue to encourage people to organize and never discourage anyone.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so here's one of the questions that was sent in, and it does reflect on the circumstances under which Zoom has decided to censor these events. The allegation, and they've decided to do so around the allegation that that a university event that features or focuses on the life and political advocacy of someone like Leila Khaled is itself an act of material support for terrorism. And we know that terror is a scare word that's always been used to silence all forms of anti-colonial speech and action, whether in faraway countries or here in the US, where, for example, the extremist labels have been leveled at BLM protesters in the streets over the course of this summer. So the questioner would like you to respond to some of these, respond to that allegation, whether in legal terms or existential terms. And I should add that the initial response that I got from a university administrator was that federal law overrides the contractual obligations that Zoom has, to a licensee, a university licensor. So that's just to add a layer of explanation in the situation. So, who would like to jump in and address that question?
I can jump in. It's without basis, as you said, Andrew. Zionists like to levy these charges, and they levy them pretty frequently. These false accusations of anti-Semitism and support for terrorism charges. Leila Khaled was not speaking in any official capacity, nor was she paid for any of these events. And when Zoom inquired to SFSU with regards to potential violations of these laws, FSU was really clear in saying, no, there's no violation here. And Zoom pulled the plug anyway. And I'll just say, Leila spoke a week later on Zoom at another event. It was not a university event. And there was no problems with that. So I don't think that Zoom is actually concerned with this. If they were concerned with this, they wouldn't just pull the plug when Zionists complain. Leila has important things to say, and this is really about people hearing what she has to say, and they're free to disagree with her ideas or not listen if they don't want to. But the real question is what do anti-Palestinian groups not want you to hear? Why do they need to control everything that gets said in the university through these censorship campaigns? And I think it's really important for freedom of speech and expression and open debate at college campuses that universities aren't subjected to Zoom, as far as censorship.
I guess the thing that I was trying to say, but I'm sure I didn't say it very clearly or very well, for which I apologize, is I'm interested in several contradictions. I think there are many. I have never experienced a college campus as a zone for free speech. I've always experienced it. I've always understood it to be a place where speech is controlled and regulated and suppressed, and where most of what learning is on a college campus is learning how to regulate and control and constrain your own speech, and then to do that under the rubric of freedom. And at the same time, the college campus is like a church for free speech. It's like a church where free speech is constantly violated as an idea, but where it is also sanctified and sacralized as some sort of false, idol. And I just think it's horrific and brutal and vicious what Zoom did. But I also think it's important for us to acknowledge, A, that they did it, and B, that it confirms rather than goes against the grain of what policies have always obtained on the university as a particular place where a certain mode of public-private partnership or gov-state and corporate partnership works, and where it has always worked. I just think it's important for us to at least think about that and consider that. And I also just want to say that, again, I've never been happy about the luxuries I've had to indulge in something that simulates free speech, knowing that those luxuries are predicated on the impoverishment of other people and their capacities to simulate that free speech. That's not a contradiction that I've ever felt, or that I feel like anybody should feel comfortable simply living with. Part of what's so important about being able to listen and to hear to someone like Layla Khaled is that she has always exercised her capacity to speak against the grain of anybody's so-called capacity to repress it. Like, she's always spoken anyway, whether the speech was free or not. And I feel like maybe like that's the kind of courage that we need to learn, and that we can hopefully pick up from her example. Because what we have to do is figure out how to speak anyway. Because I don't think they're going to stop doing this anytime soon. And that means we have to not only figure out how to speak anyway, but we also have to get a much sharper and clearer understanding of who it is exactly that we're speaking to, or maybe better, who it is that we're speaking with.
Nerdeen, I know you had some things to say about terrorism in your comments. You want to amplify any of those in relation to the question, how we deal with this allegation, even though we might know it's entirely nebulous?
Well, Palestinians have been dealing with this accusation before Zoom, before, college campuses wanted to focus on us. And, even before 9/11, a lot of people talk about a post 9/11 USA. Growing up here in New York City, I knew that Palestinians were always vilified with that phrase. So on one level, it's kind of like I'm numb to it. It's like an expected thing, just like how they call us anti-Semitic when, I'm Palestinian. Of course, I'm gonna be fighting for Palestine, and anyone who supports human rights or who supports liberation of oppressed people and oppressed struggles would be fighting for Palestine. But at that level, it kind of feels like expected, but at the same time, I don't want to minimize it or ignore it, because, these are fear tactics that they use often to silence other people. And while, I think at the end of the day, we should be organizing in our communities too, not just on college campuses. So it was really refreshing and amazing to hear what Fred had to say about that. But at the end of the day, they do use also our college campuses to regulate outside of that. Because if people see me, an activist who's well known in the community, who's been organizing for Palestine for a long time, being torn down by my own college campus, then what message is that going to send to everybody else? So, I think it's good to also amass support from others to push back against that, while maintaining the idea that we shouldn't and can't be organizing on private property. Zoom, Facebook, Twitter, they can kick us off whenever they want. And, even the algorithms of what gets traction versus, like people are using the term shadow banning now. What isn't popularized on social media is stuff that they control as well. So, I just think it's important to use these arenas as strategically as possible while we're in them, but also not get wrapped up in it and create our own spaces outside of that.
Okay, thank you. Another question is about allyship. Presumably how non-Palestinians are able, to be good allies when it comes to, the defense of Palestinian rights. Because speaking of fear tactics, there are many, 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 many people who are afraid to jump to the defense of Palestinian rights for fear of being slimed, character assassination, career sabotage, public vilification, pressure on your employer to punish you, fire you from your job, and a host of other dirty tricks. And to a large degree that, that does explain some of the reticence that people have, even in the academy where, speech is supposed to be protected. The AAUP, we know that this is an uphill struggle. So are there lessons to learn about how to become good allies from the point of view of, non-Palestinians? Because Palestinians bear the brunt of these attacks. And in addition, other part of the question was, there was a lot of talk about white allyship this summer in response to BLM protests. What did we learn from those? Do they have any relevance to the question of non-Palestinian allyship?
I guess I can quickly jump in and just say, while I think that everybody around the world should be supporting the oppressed, nations and oppressed people, oppressed struggles of the world, because that's what necessitates our freedom. In order for us to actually, be free, we have to fight for everyone's freedom. It is very difficult for people to speak up for Palestine, but at the very least in the US, I kind of see it like everyone here also has a more moral responsibility to do so, not just because, of oppressed nation solidarity and struggle solidarity, but also because the US government is, much more than complicit and implicated, but part and parcel in the suffering that Palestinians face on a daily basis. From the fact that they give Israel the highest amount of military aid, more than any other country in the world. They also represent their interests in the United Nations, vetoing, any form of accountability that Israel would face on a PR level, on a diplomatic level, on a military economic level. The US is right there standing behind Israel. And many people say that if it wasn't for the US, Israel could not exist. Israel's settler colonial project, genociding Palestinians, built off of the theft of their land, could not exist. And people even joke that Israel is basically a military base for the US in the Middle East. So, I see it as the responsibility of every US citizen who pays taxes, whose money goes to Israel, who, have some form of, just like we're trying to hold our government accountable for anything else they're doing, this needs to be on the top of that list because, we're funding it and we're supporting it. And even as individuals, if we're not saying anything, then we're complicit in it.
Any comments about allyship, Fred?
Well, I mean, I think I think allyship is a good thing, but you actually have to really be careful and explicit about what exactly it is that you're allied with, and let's, if there was such a thing as a genuine and authentic allyship, it would mean that you were involved in fighting the same fight, not just because, not out of any sort of really, well, and that fight would be a fight not only against very specific material conditions, but it would also be a fight against a certain idea, right? It would be a fight about principles too. Mm-hmm. And, it's how can you be a genuine ally of the Palestinian struggle against the settler colonial state called Israel, if you're not actually against the settler colonial state called the United States of America, right? Like if, in other words, you would have to not only be an ally in some sense of the Palestinian people, but you'd also have to be an ally at the level of a refusal of refusing the legitimacy of the settler colonial state as a structure, right? As an idea. And I actually think that maybe that's kind of where allyship breaks down. And it raises a bunch of other questions too. You know, I don't believe that any rational person would think of the United States as a country which is like, you know, primarily populated with friends of the Jewish people. History belies that, you know. So what exactly is the United States' investment in Israel as an entity? You know, and I think that investment has to do with the fact that Israel now has allowed itself to stand in for the settler colonial state. It stands in for that principle. To defend Israel is to defend that principle. To defend the legitimacy of Israel is to defend also the legitimacy of the United States too. And, you know, so what it would mean to be an ally, I think, would be to say, well, we call into question these principles. We call into question these ideas. And then at that point, allyship becomes a matter of practice and not just a matter of making statements, right? Like what will your practice of anti-settler coloniality be today here where you are, you know? At least, I don't know, that's what I've been thinking. What I mostly would love to do is not talk about it so much, but to listen to ideas too, which is A, why it is that I'm glad to be here with you guys today, and B, why I'm so concerned that we actually actively figure out ways to be able to talk with each other, right? Whether these people shut down, you know, their mechanics and their machinery and their technology or not. You know, we can decry the fact that they have done so, and we can talk all we want to about why it is wrong for them to have done so. But we also have to figure out how we can develop our ways, you know, to speak with and ground with each other, so to speak.
Well, I hope that's a principle that is encourages people at campuses like NYU to come out of the woodwork and start that conversation. If nothing else, what happened today with the shutdown, you know, should hopefully lead to that. I was reminded in your comments about allyship, you know, that famous quote from Lila Watson, Aboriginal activist, who said, if you come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And I think in some ways that that notion of working through our own personal liberation in relation to, it goes beyond advocacy. It's something that's beyond. I think that's what you were, how you were framing it. Just, I guess the last thing, just before we end this webinar, relates to, again, the tail end of Fred's comments there. How do we move forward? How do we make the most of this this situation, the shutdown? For sure, start the conversations on campuses that people perhaps have been reluctant to enter into hitherto. I'm sure Palestine Legal has plans for operationalizing its campaign around this issue, which has also happened at other universities. Claremont Colleges was also threatened with a shutdown of their webinar today, and I'm sure that's not the end of it. So just speculate on things we can do moving forward to make the most of what is in some ways an opportunity, right?
Well, on our side, we're definitely having conversations. We'll leave it at that. With professors and other people at their schools across the country who are being censored in this way. So yeah, we're definitely looking at legal avenues for redress, being a legal organization. But I think a lot of conversations are being had and need to be had. What does it mean in this day and age now when Zoom can be our putative censors for everything? And I think it's a really important question. And it's not just about Palestine. It's about a lot of different issues as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's great to have these special occasions to get together and hear, you know, what people have to say, you know, on what we imagine to be a larger scale, a scale that we generally think of as, you know, exceeding the smaller scale of the classroom itself. And, you know, and now most of us are kind of dependent upon Zoom as a technology to even allow that small scale to take place, since most of us don't meet in person. But I know that a lot of my colleagues and friends, what justifies the work that we think we do as scholars and teachers is that we think that it is involved in and part and parcel with the general project of liberation. And if now the general project of liberation on some fundamental level goes through Palestine, and if every class that we're ever teaching is in some sense meant to be, you know, a contribution to that general project of liberation, then there ought to be some room in every class that all of us who imagine ourselves to be allies teach, to take up specifically the question of Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
It's great to have special teach-ins and webinars, but I'm kind of at the point now where when I teach my classes on 19th century, you know, Afro-American literature, it doesn't seem to me anymore that I can teach that class without talking about Palestine. So that's what we should do, it seems to me. Mm-hmm. And let's see what happens when they shut down every class, right?
Yeah.
There shouldn't be a class that doesn't take up these questions. Okay. So that's kind of what I'm thinking.
Nerdeen?
Yeah, as a community organization, we're in the process of reimagining what that looks like, with having to be relegated to Zoom and these different corporate apps and programs that determine what can and can't be said. I mean, people talk about boycotting Zoom, but what are we going to go to? You know, Microsoft Teams, or Google, you know, which are also have their own record of oppression and supporting oppression worldwide. So I just don't. I don't think that Zoom is particular in this sense. It all goes back to everything that we've been discussing throughout this whole panel. The US being a settler colonial entity, Israel being a settler colonial entity, and capitalism and, you know, everything like propping this up and allowing or, you know, determining what can and can't be said and who can and can't say it. You know, I know that people were able in the past to even fundraise for the IRA here in New York City. Meanwhile, you know, simply bringing Layla Khaled to come speak is like material support to a terrorist organization. So, you know, even that becomes murky, but, you know, I don't know what that looks like, what it would look like right now to push back against these corporations. But just want to reiterate that it's not a battle that we can get caught up in, that ultimately distracts us from building up our own platforms, because ultimately that's what's necessary. And that includes having a platform that's rooted in our communities, and also having space for us to talk outside of that, to connect with other liberation struggles across the country and around the world. And I'm hoping we get, more tech experts in the movement, and people who actually work within the community. So it's not a separate project, but, part and parcel of the same struggle for liberation and the infrastructure that we're continuously setting up for that struggle.
Well, terrific. I want to thank everyone really for enduring this day. It's been a long day for all of us, given everything that happened, trying just to put on this event. I'm glad we were able to stage it and record it so that people, it's been a remarkable conversation. Just from the perspective of AAUP, I want to say that for those of you who are in a position to join the AAUP, please do. And if you don't have a chapter, an AAUP chapter in your campus, it's very easy to form one. And it's a very useful organization to have in your campus. And from the perspective of USACBI, also want to urge you all, if you haven't done so, to become a BDS signatory, and also to join in the productive life of being an ally for Palestinian rights. And if you're a teacher, as Fred suggested, build Palestinian content into your curriculum. It's a very good suggestion. So thanks to all the speakers again, and to those of you who are listening, and this conversation will undoubtedly continue. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.